Hi, everyone. Welcome to Women Work Your Faith. My name is Sylvia Johnson, and today I am covering the Sunday school lesson for Sunday, November the 19th. The subject for Sunday, November the 19th is Beginning of Freedom. Our Bible basis is Exodus, the 14th chapter, the 21st through the 30th verse. Creates a way out of bondage through Jesus Christ. Our memory verse. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day out of the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead upon the seashore. That is Exodus, the 14th chapter, the 30th verse, and that is your King James Version. So in today's lesson, I have some notes and things I just want to touch base with before I get into the scripture. We are looking at the children of Israel after they have left. We're picking up after last week's lesson, which was the Passover. And so God had moved through Egypt and had taken the life of every firstborn male, but had spared the lives of those who participated in the Passover according to his instructions. And so now the children of Israel have left. They have great substance. They are on their way to worship their God. And God tells Moses, he sends them to a space. As he has it mapped out, and he sends them to a specific place and tells them to camp there. And he lets Moses know that he's going to harden Pharaoh's heart and send him out there to follow after them, and that he is going to be glorified. He is going to get his honor from Pharaoh and the people. So the things that are happening here aren't just happenstance. You see in the beginning of this chapter that all of this was orchestrated by God. And then we're going to talk about in the lesson, I'm going to point out and show you how that is reaffirmed in what happens. And also, you'll understand that this is reaffirming that every lesson in this quarter has been the word of God that he spoke and it coming true. And so in the beginning of this verse, he speaks this word to Moses of what's going to happen. And then in the lesson, we see it coming true. It's very interesting. I wrote in here, we as people have different levels of faith. And as you study this lesson, keep in mind that God is trying to bring us up the way he's bringing up the children of Israel in the lesson. And so, some of us don't, we believe in God, but we're kind of wondering about these miracles. Or I believe God is real, but I don't know if he's really involved in my life. Or I believe there is a God, but I don't know if it's that God. And so this is a really good opportunity for us to dig in here and to allow God to increase our faith. And then also, just want to mention we started a new podcast. And if you want to check it out, it's called Bible Stories for Adults. We'll be adding to it every month. So without further ado, let's get into the lesson. So we're starting in Exodus, the 14th chapter, the 21st verse. And in this, it says, and Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. And in the 22nd verse, it says, and the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea upon the dry ground, and the waters were a wall unto them on their right hand and on their left. So before this, in the 19th verse, and the 20th verse, and I'm going to tell us about this for a reason, because it's just hold on to this nugget, okay? It says, and the angel of God, which went before the camp of Israel, removed and went behind them. And the pillar of the cloud went from before their face and stood behind them. And it came between the camp of the Egyptians and the camp of Israel. And it was a cloud and darkness to them, but it gave light by night to these, so that the one came not near the other all night. So the children of Israel were led by this pillar, a cloud by day and a flame by night, I believe. And what happened was it was before them and it was leading them on their journey. But in this instance, it moves. And so this angel of God moves and it goes behind them to separate them from the Egyptians. And the reason why I read that is you see here where the lesson picks up in 21. God had told Moses to stretch out his hands, and he did that, and God parted the sea. The Bible makes it plain who did the parting. Okay. God parts the sea, and the water moves and becomes as a wall as the children of Israel come through. So they are able to cross over, and there's this partition behind them. Okay. Now, all the while that the water is parting, it says that there's an east wind blowing through the night. So this wind is coming through, and it is pushing the water up to where it should go. And while that's happening, the Egyptians are behind the angel of God, not really seeing what's going on. And so after the waters are divided, it says the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea. So it went into the space where the water was, but it was dry now. And that's a very significant point. Just hold on to that. Hold on to all of it, but hold on to that. Because they're walking through a space. If you've ever, if you filled your sink up with water, and then you let all the water out, the water is gone, but the sink would be wet. If you filled up a swimming pool, you let the water out, it would be gone, but it would be wet. But the Bible tells us it was dry. So if you just think about it for a minute, every drop, every molecule of water had to obey. Okay. God told the water to move, and all of it moved. Okay. So when they stepped out to where the water was, there was none there on the ground where they were walking. Not a single drip drop of water was with them. Okay. And so it's not just that the sea separated and they skirted through, but the magnitude and the significance of how this happened. I mean, it was truly miraculous, because I spilled, you all don't see it, but I keep water on the side. I spilled some on the floor, and I was wiping, trying to get it off the kitchen floor. But God blew that wind through and got rid of all of it, right? So, if you want to go forward a little bit, and I talked about the magnitude and how miraculous this was. After this experience, Moses and the children of Israel sing praises to God. And in Genesis the 15th chapter, the 8th verse, it says, "And with the blast of thy nostrils, the waters were gathered together, the flood stood upright as a heap, and the depths were congealed in the heart of the sea." And it just describes his view. It says, the blast of thy nostrils. He's giving full credit to God. Yes, Moses was the one who stretched out his hand, but he is saying, that was all you. Okay, you blew that wind. And then it says the waters were gathered together. So I told you it was dry. So every drop of water had to huddle together up to make this wall. And the flood stood upright as a heap. So you've got this water that's flowing, and then it goes and parts its way. And it says, and the depths were congealed in the heart of the sea. So I had looked up that word congealed in my concordance, because I was like, I'm thinking about Jell-O, right? And so I looked to see how they were interpreting it. And it talks about it becoming firm, to become solid, not necessarily hard, but something that becomes firm and is set. And that is a very interesting description, because when have you ever seen water firm or set? And so the water became as it has never been before. As the water became as it not ever typically is, but because God breathed on it, it did exactly what his intention was for it to do, regardless of what its status was before. So I hope I painted that picture clearly. And so moving forward, not necessarily the lesson, but I'm really going to harp on this God and water bit, because we should not be surprised that the water did as God commanded it, because the Bible gives us many examples where God spoke, and water did. And I have some of them listed in the description. I put my reference scriptures down there, and I'm not going to read them all. But some of the examples I have in Genesis 1 in creation, God parted the waters from the bottom, the waters above. So he made the heavens, the firmament, and then the waters beneath. And we don't think of the heavens as being wet, but we know now, all of us that went through school, that the clouds are precipitation and moisture. And so God separated those waters. So he said, you water go this way and you water go that way. And they did it, right? And then when he told the water to be separated and gathered into a space, and the land came forward, the water did it. And then a really good example I have, and I do want to read part of this, is the example of Noah. And so in Genesis, the 6th chapter, in Genesis, the 6th chapter, the 17th verse, and behold, even I do bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, wherein is the breath of life from under heaven, and everything that is in the earth shall die. And so God tells Noah that he's going to bring this deluge, this uncontrollable gush of water. And then in the 7th chapter, the 11th and the 12th verse, we see that what God said happened. And it says in the 7th chapter of Genesis, the 11th verse, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened up, and the rain was upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. So what God said happened. Not only did he cause it to rain, but he said it, I'm going to bring this great flood. And so the water that he said to set back and be gathered into a space, he opened it up. And then the heavens, the water in the heavens, he said, y'all can come down now. And he demonstrated the magnitude of his power, because all of these things that we take for granted that are set into place are controlled by him. So a question that I have for you, and hello, how you doing, Miss Jessica Simmons? Greetings to you. A question that I have for you, if you're listening, and I'm talking about God's dominion over water. What are some other examples in the Bible where you see the power of God exercised? And we can just use the example of water, because I'm thinking of quite a few times actually where water had to come subject. And I want to name them all, but I don't want to take up all the time. So if you have an example of an encounter with God in water where he demonstrated his dominion over that, pop it in the comments. So moving forward now, Exodus, the 14th chapter, the 23rd verse. And the Egyptians pursued and went in after them to the midst of the sea, even all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. And it came to pass, and this is the 24th verse, that in the morning watch the Lord looked unto the host of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and of the cloud, and troubled the host of the Egyptians, and took off their chariot wheels, that they drave them heavily, so that the Egyptians said, let us flee from the face of Israel, for the Lord fighteth for them against the Egyptians. So in these 3 verses, and I just read Exodus 14, 23 through 25, we see that the Egyptians follow after the Israelites into the midst of the sea. So the Israelites had crossed over into the dry space where the water had been, and they were crossing. And it says the Egyptians pursued. Now, let's go back, okay? Remember, I read those 2 verses about the angel of God, and it says, but it gave light by night to these, so that the one came not near the other all the night. So the angel of God had separated them, okay? So that one did not come near the other. But the Israelites crossed over, and the Egyptians came to pursue. And so here we are, we see that God has intentionally placed something between them. But, you would think, hold on a minute, why wouldn't you keep them from coming after them? Why aren't you protecting them from being chased? That's how our mind works. Okay. And I see my thing is kind of slowing down, so I hope the service picks up a little bit. If you can't understand me, could you put it in the comments? I don't want anybody to miss what I'm saying. So here we are. We're seeing that the story isn't coming together the way that we would think it would. So let's look at it. They're following after, and it says that at the morning watch, the Lord looked unto the host. So my Bible says that the morning watch was a typical time to plan a surprise attack. And that is what's going to happen right here. So it says God looks unto the host of Egypt. Oh, well, hold on. Let's see. I just want to make sure you all can hear me. If you can, just say yes, or one person say yes. I don't want you all to miss this. Okay, I hope you all can hear me. So, the morning watch. Okay, I see a yes. The morning watch. My Bible says that was a common time to plan a surprise attack. Well, we know that the surprise is coming for them. And the Bible tells us that the Lord looks onto the Egyptians. And now what that means is God's focus is on them. We know God sees and hears all. And he is looking to them through the pillar of fire. So again, this pillar that has separated them from the Israelites. So they're pursuing them, but they cannot catch them. They cannot cross over. And his attention is turned to them, and he troubles them. So this is an example of God fighting your battle for you, right? He starts to cause disruption among the hosts of Egypt, confusion, turmoil, and so they drive their chariots hard so much that it breaks the wheels off the chariots. And they're like, wait a minute, this is out of control. And I'm sure the pillar of fire was one thing. This water that's a wall, that's another thing. But now my chariot is falling apart. It's confusion out here. I do not know what's going on. And so here we see in the 25th verse, it says, so that the Egyptians said, let us flee from the face of Israel, for the Lord fighteth for them against the Egyptians. Now this is significant because if you go back to, let's see, 14, it says in the 4th verse, and I will harden Pharaoh's heart, that he follow after them. This is what's happening. And I will be honored upon Pharaoh and upon all his hosts, that the Egyptians may know that I am the Lord. And they did so. And so God speaks. Thank you. Yes, for some reason, the video is delayed. So let me see. And I don't know why, because it's saying that the internet is strong. Let's see if I can pause it. Let's do this. I'm going to finish it, and I may re-record it and repost it so that it'll be clearer. I don't know why you can hear me, but the movements aren't together. So I just read Exodus, the 14th chapter, the 4th verse, when God said, I will be honored upon Pharaoh. And so, again, God spoke that they will recognize me. They will know me. And here in the 14th chapter, in the 25th verse, we see that it happens. When they say, let us flee from the face of Israel, for the Lord fighteth for them against the Egyptians. They recognized then who they were against. And that's how it is for some of us, right? Sometimes we recognize God because of what he's done for us. Sometimes we recognize God because he loves us. Sometimes we recognize God because we've come up against him and we've made a mistake. And so here we see the Egyptians recognize God when they realize their mistake. And so let's talk about the intentionality of this, right? Why was Pharaoh even there? He had just experienced this great plague that took away the firstborn in all of his lands, animal and people alike. Why would you pursue these people? Well, we see that the word tells us that God hardened his heart so that he would do so. It was God's intention that Pharaoh pursue until they recognized who he was. Until this point, they had not acknowledged that he was the Lord God. And even I see someone say, because he hated. Yes, he was hating. But we have to remember that God made his heart so. He started first hating, but then God said, I will harden his heart. And so God turned him over to a place where he could not be changed. And then we have to think about, well, why would God do that, right? God was intentional from the beginning. And so remember in one of our earlier lessons, and I put this down there for reference, in the 15th chapter of Genesis, when God told Abram what would happen, right? And he, and I call this the don't freak out. I'm going to show you something, don't freak out moment, where Abram has that dream and he sees the turmoil and the oppression that his descendants experience. But God assures him that he will deliver them and judge the nation that oppresses them. And then something else that we don't think about, well, we might think about it. A lot of people probably think about it, but something I hadn't thought about until recently, Joseph's dream, right? Joseph dreamed about his family bowing to him. And then we see when his family sells him into slavery and he ends up in Egypt. I think I put 3 or 4 verses down there for cross-reference in Genesis where Joseph tells his family, God intended for this to happen. And so the last one is in Genesis, the 50th chapter. I'll just read that one for the sake of time. In Genesis, the 50th chapter, the 20th verse, he's talking to his brothers, and he says, but as for you, ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive. And so he is telling them continuously, God intended for us to be here. He intended for me to be here. And so God intended for the children of Israel to be in Egypt. And we have to remember also, God is wise, right? And one of my favorite verses in Proverbs, well, it's more like a little bit of a chapter, but I'm not going to read the whole thing. In Proverbs, the 8th chapter, and it's the 22nd through the 30th verse, but it's the call of wisdom. But wisdom is describing itself and its relationship to God. And it says, starting in 22, the Lord possessed me in the beginning of his way, before his works of old. I was set up from everlasting, from the beginning, or ever the earth was. And he talks about, well, wisdom's personified as a woman. And then here, if you keep going down, it says in the 30th chapter, then I was by him as one brought up with him, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing always before him. And so wisdom is always present with God. It is integral, and it is his pleasure to do what is wise. And so why did God do all of this? Because his wisdom requires it. And what was he working towards? He was working towards redemption, having his name glorified, bringing back his children who did not know or recognize him. And so he makes his name known to the children of Israel and to the Egyptians in this process. And I wrote another verse down there, and I won't get too far into that. But Jesus lets us know that God is a strategist. When he talks about, no man starts a project unless he's counted up the cost. Well, why would Jesus think that? Because that's what wisdom is. You don't set out to do something without knowing what it will require to get it done, or else you'll be sitting somewhere with your project half done. And so from the beginning, God knew what it would take for us. And he's working on that all the time. And so his plan is always for us to be redeemed and for him to be made known in the earth. So, just marinate on that because it just seems like sometimes as a kid, when I would hear this story, you kind of get stuck at the villain and the good people, and God crushed the Egyptians and things like that. And it's not the destroying of the Egyptians, it's the recognition. And for some of us, that's what it takes before we will recognize and honor God, is that we must come to the end of all of our options before we will finally say, he is God. Don't let that be you. So, moving forward, Exodus, the 14th chapter and the 26th verse. God's instructions to Moses. In 26, and the Lord said unto Moses, stretch out thine hand over the sea, that the waters may come again upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots, and upon their horsemen. And so now we see that the waters are going to close up. And in your Sunday school book, I really liked how it pointed it out. If you look on Light of the Word, it talks about 1 Peter 2:9 and how God uses people to demonstrate his power. And so God had Moses stand in that position and stretch out his hands as the symbol of what he was doing. But we all know that it was God who was moving the water back and forth. And it talks about us and how we are chosen. And our purpose is, like I said, to make him known in the earth. And so sometimes we are asked to perform miracles, and sometimes we are asked to perform things that are not what we would call miraculous. But I can tell you that loving others as yourself takes the work of God, and it's a miracle. And so we're called to do those things, to not just to be glorified ourselves, right? Not like in our other lesson where the Tower of Babel, where they wanted to make a great name for themselves. We're called to be and do those things so that we can make his name known, and that people will recognize who their creator is and who their God is. And so again, in this situation, Moses is demonstrating the power of God and his dominion over water so that the children of Israel can see, and so that the people of Egypt can see. Unfortunately for the people of Egypt, it's going to be the last thing they see. Because in 27, it says, and Moses stretched forth his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to his strength when the morning appeared. And the Egyptians fled against it, and the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. And the waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen and all the hosts of Pharaoh that came into the sea after them. There remained not so much as one of them. So the water returns to its strength. Remember, I talked about the example that Moses gave the water, and then it was congealed, and it was set, and it was firm. What the Bible is telling us is that it returns to its natural self. It returns to do what it normally does. At this point before, it was under the influence of God telling it to stay back. But now it's returned, and God has released it to do what it does. And what it does is it flows out over the Egyptians, and they are drowned in the sea. And it says anything that entered at that point from them was covered in the water. Nothing remains. But here's what's interesting. In the 29th verse, it says, the children of Israel walked upon dry land in the midst of the sea, and the waters were a wall unto them on their right hand and on their left. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day out of the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead upon the seashore. So it gives you a comparison. You have two people, two bodies, two congregations going the same route, but they're having two different experiences. And what's the difference? Their position with God. And so the children of Israel are in the same space, they're just moving ahead of the Egyptians. But because they are following after God, their experience is totally different. And the children of Egypt, the chariots and the host of Pharaoh, they're coming through that same pathway, but they're not following after God. They're moving against him. And because of that, their experience is a disaster. And so look at yourself, okay? You may be moving in the same direction as lots of people around you, but what are you doing? Where are you going? Why are you going that way? What is your intention? And as I was reading this, I thought, you can't stand before God in the wrong and think this is going to come out right. It's a no. So the children of Israel who are making their journey to go follow after their God are able to have a totally different experience in this space, an impossible experience. Let's take it there, right? When you are blessed by God in a situation, what happens is something that only he could do. And they're able to see that, and it's done for their good. But when God has executed judgment against you, what happens is also something only he could do, and it doesn't work to your good. But God's purpose is always to work for the good. And so whatever he is doing, it goes towards his plan of redemption. So I have here the last point, and I'll try not to get too deep into it. God's discerning power. Our Sunday school class last week, and then when we talked about like Noah in person and things like that, I wish you all could see our class at church because we have really great conversations. We talked about last week when I was teaching how the Spirit of God came through Egypt and was able to discern. And we talked about what the token was on the post for God. If he saw that was the sign that these people are with me, and he would pass over that house. God, we talk about this all-consuming fire and the power of God and the wrath of God, but know that, again, going back to this wisdom piece, it's discerning. He is intentional. He is not recklessly destructive. And it's not also that he wants to be destroying, because the Bible lets us know he takes no pleasure in the death of the wicked. But I tell you that God is a strategist, and he gives us many, many, many opportunities to make right and to become one with him and to be humble before him, because that's what his desire is, right? That's what the Bible tells us. He doesn't want that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. And so we know that God's desire is for us to be right and to do good. But what also happens is that we know that God is discerning. And the Bible tells us, I, the Lord, judge the heart, right? He knows who is for him. He knows who to give another chance to, who needs grace right now, when grace needs to stop. And so we see God discerning here in the midst of the sea. He sees his children and allows them to pass through, but he also sees the threat to them and the ones who would stand against him, and his judgment is on them. So I am so disappointed in the video, but this was such a great conversation, and I really appreciate you all in the comments sticking with me. So we'll go back and look at the lesson aim. It says, by the end of the lesson, we will describe how God made a way for the Israelites when there seemed to be none. I think we talked about that, how God opened up that sea for them and the magnitude of that being done, and how God exercised his dominion over all creation. And thank you to Miss Jessica Simmons pointing out that Jesus walked on the water and he commanded the storm to cease. Yes, he did. And I love that example because, talking about Moses saying the water congealed, and I talked about, when have you ever seen the water be set and firm? But when Jesus stepped out there, it held him up. Okay. Just like when they woke him up in the middle of the night, he walked out there and told it, peace, be still, and it stopped. And so we see the power of God, and how everything, all of creation has to obey him. Appreciate the freedom we have in God's plan. And so I talked about how God's plan from the beginning, right? The great strategist, the one who he counted up the cost. He knew from the beginning when he created us what it would be for us to be like him in his image and his likeness. And he thought we were worth it. And because of that, he works the plan of redemption and we can be made free. And so, like I said, please don't be one of the ones where we got to get to the worst possible scenario before we will acknowledge that he is God. You can acknowledge that he is God now and be free, be totally free. And then list ways to promote freedom for those who are oppressed. Oh, wow, that could take a while. But if we go back and we think about this lesson, and I talked about it, right? God's desire for us to be redeemed and us being made in his image and his likeness. Therefore, we should be the same way. We should not be like the Egyptians. And I told my Sunday school class this last week, first y'all wanted to get rid of them. Now you want to keep them. And then you're like, I'll never let you go. Well, that should not be our desire. We should not want to deal harshly with each other and oppress one another and make each other's burdens heavy. We should be doing as much as we can to bear one another's burdens, like the Bible tells us to love one another, to advocate and stand in the gap for one another, to be leaders when God calls us to be leaders, to speak out, right? To live justly and walk humbly before our God. And so that's how people get free. And we see here that the Egyptians and the Israelites were not fighting each other. God was fighting for them. And so we have to use the wisdom and the knowledge of God to know how the battle should go. Because if the Israelites had turned around and tried to attack or, swing an axe or something like that, God would not have been glorified in that. And that should be our goal, is that God be glorified in everything that we do. And so we have to use the wisdom of God. Now, there were times when God told people to fight, okay? But again, he's glorified in that. So we just have to remember that our source first is God. Our example first is God. Who we should be like is God. And he made that possible for us through his son, Jesus Christ, when he gave up his life so that we could be, it's my word for today, redeemed. So, I feel like I should just record the audio. I am trying to figure out this internet because it tells me the signal is strong and then I get in here and it starts skipping and jumping. So I sincerely apologize. Thank you to everyone who stayed in. And to anyone who watches this later, I'll pull a note to let you all know that you probably should listen and not focus on the screen too much. I did include my reference scriptures in the description box. If you have any questions or anything else that I didn't cover, I like It's Your World, where you laughed at me saying, unfortunately. I get that from my dad. He does that when he's going to say something. He goes, unfortunately. But thank you all. I love when you all interact. I appreciate it. I'm probably going to teach the lesson next week. It may not be on Friday, but I will post so that you all can get the message when it's going to be. So if you haven't subscribed or click the notifications, make sure to do that. Thank you all. I hope you all are blessed. Have a wonderful weekend, and I will see you next time in Sunday school.